right, good evening, everyone. Good evening, welcome. Welcome to this second part series on Assyrianism and the debates within Assyrianism. This is going to be a class that's going to be roughly half of a discussion or a lecture, and then we're going to get into a discussion. So I should say half is going to be a lecture on Assyrianism, how it began, what it is, what are our expectations of it, and then I'm going to pose some questions to Miss Sarah Gawo and Mr. Pierre Younan, and then what we'll do is open the floor for you. But please hang on until we get through the class and the discussions between myself and Pierre and Sarah. All right, so the rise of Assyrianism. We talked early about Aramean nationalism. We talked about Chaldean nationalism or Chaldeanism or Arameanism. These words are used. And today we're going to discuss Assyrianism. And we're also going to refer to an understanding of our culture as Syriac or Assyrian. So Suraya, and also Assyrians. Now, what is Assyrianism? First question. In essence, it represents an effort to transcend the sectarian divisions, and we've talked about this through the writings of many of the authors in Assyrianism, such as Fredun, and we'll see some quotes from some prominent writers today, Fredun, Nahum Fayed, Binyamin Arsanis, Hakim Baba Parhat, and others. It is a conscious movement to reconnect the dispersed ecclesiastical branches, so the denominations of the Assyrian people, through a unified understanding of their shared history, ancestral land, demography, language, collective will, and destiny. It seeks to safeguard the Assyrian identity against the pressures of assimilation. So now that the Assyrians are mostly in the West, they've been dispersed all over the world, they're living in the diaspora. It seeks to counter assimilation in the diaspora by reaffirming the distinct elements that define the nation: common language, memory, collective memory, heritage, and symbols. Okay, the winged bull, the Assyrian star. When you see it, you connect with the past and you connect with other people. It forges a living bond between today's Assyrians and the martyrs. So there's a history of martyrs, just like in Christianity. Martyrdom was revered, and in Assyrianism, it is also revered and thought to be kind of a foundational occurrence, that there were martyrs throughout history for Assyrianism up until the present day, but also in the past. Ultimately, it envisions a renewed and reimagined Assyrian community anchored in truth. Now, this is important. When we say reimagined, we're not saying completely made up, okay? Lacking in any concrete reality, anchored in truth, guided by clarity, and conscious of its historical journey. So there is a great deal of emphasis placed on continuity, Assyrian continuity. So the first question we ask is it based on historical truth, or is it a mythical understanding? And so we're going to see people saying that, for example, well, it's really, a concocted thing, or it is, the British, as Adam Becker has said, the British are the ones who really, and the Americans who taught the Assyrians, who gave them kind of the foundational spiritual, ecclesiastical, and even secular understanding of what nationality is. And the Assyrians picked up from them this idea. They were really Syriac, Suraya, and then they got this idea that they are Assyrian in part because of that association with American evangelicals, with the British, and also on the other hand, because there were these archaeological digs by people like Laird and Rassam and others, that Assyrians began to associate themselves, either because they themselves started thinking about this, or because it was put in their minds by various Western archaeologists and Western authors. Well, that's not what a lot of people say, especially, for example, people like Simo Parpola, who are experts on Assyrian history. So they tell us, for example, yes, we have the word Suraya, but it's not really a word that is very distant from the word Aturaya or Ashuraya or Asuraya. So the word Asurayu, he tells us, Assyrian, had a variant, Surayu, in late Assyrian times. The phonology of Suraya or Suryoyo implies that this term, which is crucial to the identity of the present-day Aramaic-speaking peoples, meaning Chaldeans, meaning Syriac Orthodox, meaning members of the Church of the East, members of the Syriac Catholic community, which is crucial for them, is in indigenous self-designation. Very important. Remember, Aaron Butts talked about how the self-designation was Aramean. Well, it turns out not to be true according to a person who knows much better than Aaron Butts, and that is Simo Parpola. And he tells us indigenous self-designation, which the Aramaic-speaking Assyrians shared with their Akkadian-speaking fellow citizens. So this understanding of this self-designation of Suraya or Asuraya goes hand in hand with what we use today. So when people like Adam Becker and Aaron Butts think that this is a major shift from Suraya to Aturaya, according to a person like Simo Parpola, who's an Assyriologist who knows the history of this word, that's not the case. He also tells us that the Neo-Assyrian Empire was a multi-ethnic state composed of many peoples and tribes of different origins. Its ethnic diversity notwithstanding, it was a uniformly structured political entity, well-defined and well-guarded, with well-guarded borders, and the Assyrian kings certainly regarded it as a unified whole. The land of Ashur, Mat Ashur, whose territory they constantly strove to expand. To the outside world, it must have appeared as a uniform, monolithic whole whose inhabitants were unhesitatingly identified as Assyrians, regardless of their ethnic backgrounds. And this, by the way, is often thought to be, well, Assyria was Aramaicized. You know, somehow the Arameans overwhelmed the Assyrians and everybody started speaking their language. That's sort of how people like Eckhard Fromm in his book on Assyria puts it. But really, what is crucial to understand is when Simo Parpola tells us that it was a multi-ethnic empire, you had people from Egypt, you had Mitanni, you had Urartians, you had Medes, you had all kinds of people coming in, and Israelites, Judeans coming in, and over time, you see them picking up Assyrian names. So you almost kind of like assimilating into this Mat Ashur, into the larger Assyrian entity, and being regarded by others outside of the land of Ashur as indeed Assyrians. In fact, the Arameans are one example, and the late Frederick Mario Fallis, who focused on the late Neo-Assyrian period, and in terms of the assimilation of Arameans, he said in sum, the people called Arameans all but disappear after a long history going back to the Ahlamu. What he's talking about is how the Assyrians referred to them, the Ahlamu and the Arameans. And according to scholars like Jonathan Volk, he says, well, the Ahlamu and the Aramayu, when the Assyrians called them, they weren't necessarily an ethnic group. Unlike the Assyrians, as you saw Simo Parpola pointed out, he's telling us that the Assyrians are a coherent whole, as it were. It's a state, it's backed by state institutions, it is backed by a military, it is backed by an imperial budget, as it were. Well, the Aramayu or Ahlamu were not that at all. When the Assyrians referred to the Ahlamu and the Aramayu, they usually spoke about people outside of the empire. Now, when they spoke about the Aramaic language, that's altogether something different. And as other scholars have said, we need to distinguish between the language and the people. But at any rate, Mario Fallis, who is a prominent Assyriologist, tells us that the Ahlamu or the Aramayu are all Assyrians now. At one point, they become Assyrians. But Aramean ethnicity survives in the form of distinctive language with its attendant cultural contents, whatever those are. I'm not sure, and he doesn't define those. But as we'll see, other scholars say, what are you talking about in terms of an Aramean attendant culture? I don't get what that is exactly. Okay, so we can say language because even the Assyrians refer to the two languages the empire and the state and the kingdom uses: Akkadian, Akkadayu, and Aramayu. Okay, and sometimes the word Ashurayu is used for Akkadayu, more native, and then Aramayu is different. Now, the scribes that are Aramayu, writing in the Aramaic language, are not necessarily of ethnicity of the Aramayu. They are the writers in that particular language. They're recording in a particular script or language. Now, when we talk about the archaeology, because much has been made about, well, there were these Aramean states, and this thing was very coherent and understood, and even the Bible understands it. In the Old Testament, there are references to it. Abraham was a wandering Aramean, on and on. But these scholars, Ackermans and Schwartz, who have dug in Syria and in Turkey, looked at the archaeological evidence in a very significant way, tell us that when assessing the significance of Luwian or Aramean states in Syria, what are known as Aramean states, that's why they're put in quote marks, it must be recalled that our information on the ethnic composition of the diverse Iron Age regional states in Syria primarily concerns the rulers. As a result, it is by no means clear what the ethno-linguistic makeup of the majority of the population of these polities was. Certainly, the material culture shows no distinctions between states dominated by the Luwians or Luvians or Arameans. Well, Bonatz takes us a step further, and he says the ruling classes in the so-called Aramean kingdoms of Syria never even refer to themselves as Aramean. As an ethnic term, Aramean is a foreign construct. So remember, Aaron Butt said it was a self-designation of these people. Now, looking back in history, we have Bonatz telling us that this was a foreign construct. Okay, this term was a foreign construct. Aramean is a foreign construct generated from who else but the Assyrians, biblical and only a few local sources. So not much there in terms of a self-designation. Certainly, I would say insufficient. So this is the part of the lecture where we're focused on the historical truth of an identity. All right. So with that historical past established, you have people rising. So how did Assyrianism begin? We have to know, and we have to distinguish Assyrianism from the Assyrian past, okay, the ancient past. Certainly, it is a modern movement by, I think, any careful designation. It doesn't exist in the past. It certainly doesn't exist in the classical age. So we don't have, monks running around talking about this as a movement, Assyrianism. We have references, we have pride in the ancient past, but we don't have this as a movement by which to operate a collectivity. It arose in urban centers, for example, in Ahmed and Urmia, Diyarbakir and Urmia. It begins among intellectuals and professionals, such as the person you see here, the great Na'um Faiq, who left his homeland and came to the United States. It begins, for example, in Kharput also, where a community of Assyrians lived, where the Euphrates College was established in 1876. It was in this college, one of the earliest Assyrian nationalists, or Assyrianists, I would say, Professor Ashur Yousif, was educated and later taught. Now, what did he teach us? What did he tell us? What was it that he stood for? The hindrance, he told us, before the advancement of the Assyrian people was not so much the attacks from without as it was from within. The doctrinal and sectarian disputes and struggles, like Monophysitism or Miaphysitism, one nature of Christ, Diaphysitism, like, for example, Nestorianism or the Church of the East's Christology, two natures in Christ, is a good example. These, he tells us, caused division spiritually and nationally among the people who quarreled among themselves, even to the point of shedding blood. To this very day, the Assyrians are still known by various names, such as Nestorians, Jacobites, and Chaldeans. And so what he's trying to do is say, this is very bad. It is a bad situation that we need to come out of as a people. And of course, he's repeated years and years later, one's being an Assyrian by David Perley, a lawyer in the United States, on the east coast of the United States, a member of the Syriac Orthodox Church. One's being Assyrian is a synthesis of heritage, religion, culture, and emotional consciousness that transcends all diversities, theological, demographic, and otherwise. So again, transcending the denominations, the sectarian understanding of being an Assyrian. I'm a member of the Church of the East. I'm a member of the Chaldean Church. I am Syriac Orthodox. Transcending that. To be an Assyrian is to feel the past is my heritage. I shall not forget it, or I shall forget it not. Nice flair to that. The present, my responsibility. The future, my challenge. So on the side of Oromia, Assyrians who left their native churches for a number of Western churches, including the Russian Orthodox Church, and from whom came forth the intellectuals who formulated, one could say, reimagined. Again, please don't understand this idea as a complete concoction, made up whole cloth. That's not the case. Reimagined is simply a different way of thinking about something. Reimagine the idea of the Assyrian nation stretching in time from the depths of history to the present time. We have a coherent history. We go all the way back. They sought to identify with that entity since they could no longer identify with their church, and since the New World Order called for national and not religious affiliation. This is very important. The world was changing at this time, okay? The end of the 19th century saw the rise of nationalism in Europe. So if the advanced nations of the world were understanding themselves from an ethnic or national perspective, so too must we start thinking about that. So their Assyrian development on the eve of the Great War, Assyrians of Urmia were gaining Western education and literacy. They were interacting with various other nationalities. They were becoming more cosmopolitan. Schools were increasing. Communication was increasing. What Benedict Anderson called print capitalism was increasing. Assyrian interaction with modernity is increasing. And of course, with that, awareness of secular identity and growing nationalism is developing. Here you see a picture of a young Fredun Bet Oraham or Fredun Aturaya. Now, what did Fredun Aturaya tell us, and what did he want to do? After the February Russian 1917 revolution, Fredun Aturaya, Benjamin and Arsanis and Baba Parhat founded the first Assyrian political party. Again, a very new thing. This was a developing idea, okay? This wasn't an ancient idea, forming a political party along national lines. And he tells us the goal of the Free Assyria unity is to establish, this is in the what's called the Urmia Manifesto. The Free Assyrian unity is to establish the future of the national self-governing in the regions like Urmia, Mosul, Tur Abdin, Nasibin, Jazira, Julamark, along with the reunification with the Great Free Russia in terms of economic and military arrangements. So the idea was we want to create a union in Assyria that is made up of, again, rising above, remember, rising above the denominations, rising above also the demography. This is something new. We're no longer a tribe. We're no longer a region. We are not just the people of Urmia. We are the Hakkari, we are the Tur Abdin, we are the Jazira, on and on. Assyria is a great people and reaching back into the past. And then, of course, you have the criticisms written in Kichwa. This particular article was in 1917 when Benjamin Arsanis writes, with much anger and rage because he sees no progress being made. He says this, if we write truthfully, we as a nation are nothing. We do not even possess a name. So he's pressing his people to come up with a historical name, not just the names of denominations. That's what he means. We don't have a name. We very much resemble the inhabitants of the forest, existing without pondering our identity. Why? Because he's saying the people who live in the forest are not exposed to the modern centuries, are not exposed to the modern movements, are not exposed to what's happening in the West. So we need to live like a modern people, and we need to understand that Assyrianism means much more than the denominations that we have. Again, the desire to rise above the denominations. Now, within the Assyrian sphere, okay, it must be stated that, and by the Assyrian sphere, I mean all of the people that are otherwise often identified as Syriac speaking or Aramaic speaking people. Assyrian begins to rub certain people the wrong way. Assyrian as an identity and culture become increasingly identified with the Nestorians alone or with the members of the Church of the East, while the Chaldeans and Jacobites as church communities distance themselves completely from one another. This in particular was in the aftermath of the Simele massacre, but also before. There was a desire to kind of drift away from this drive. So much so that there is even, and we've got to carefully look at this, there's even an Assyrian patriarch at this time of the Church of the East who distances himself from people like Fredun Suraya. So, for example, it is said that Mar Binyamin Shumon, in a number of sources, seeks to distance himself from the foundational ideas of people like Fredun Suraya and Binyamin Arsanis. Well, there's a reason why the Chaldean patriarch and the Syriac Orthodox patriarch thought that, yes, this Assyrianism is also being particularly promoted, excuse me, in the institution of the Church of the East, is because a lot of times these lines were being repeated again and again. These literary symbols and tropes, as it were, supporting Assyrianism came from the leaders of the Church of the East. His late His Holiness Mardoncha IV tells Assyrian people, you are to honor with great pride that you are an Assyrian maintaining knowledge of your history and Assyrian language. So there was a push from, in particular, leaders of the Church of the East, so much so that it even entered liturgical services. And we see here in, for example, one of the hymns of the Church of the East, reproduced from modern Assyrian hymns by David Malik. The apostles planted a spiritual garden in the city of Edessa. The children of Assyria rushed and received baptism. So these are new kind of concepts of Assyrianism within the Church of the East. O children of the church, let us engage in fast and prayer and ask the Lord to protect our Assyrian nation. I mean, this is shockingly modern, of course, and it came from the leader of the Church of the East, who happened to push for this idea that the Church of the East is definitely one of the pillars of Assyrianism, institutionally anyway, along with the thinkers. And this may have distanced others, so we will talk about that down the road. But certainly you could see here that this idea being implanted and being part of the tradition of the Church of the East. Well, In 2020, we have Marta Wozniak-Bobinska, who wrote a book on modern Assyrian Syriac diaspora in Sweden, saying, in general, scientists reject the modern Assyrians' claim of being descended from the ancients, pointing to the role of Western missionaries in promoting this belief among many Middle Eastern Christians. So for Marta, the idea is that this is definitely something that is rejected in general. Particularly, she says, representatives of Bible studies. Now, she probably means many of the Syriac scholars whose proclivity is leaning towards, the study of religious texts, of Christological texts, of poems that have to do with faith, and so on. So she says, representatives of Bible studies in particular prefer the term Syriac Christians, and as they associate Assyrians with the people who cruelly treated ancient Jews. I'm not sure where she's getting that, but it's amazing how this particular book lacks in historical understanding. It may be describing certain aspects, certain characteristics of Assyrians living in Sweden, but certainly it is lacking in an understanding of historical underpinnings of the idea of Assyrianism. In addition to being opposed from within, of course, Arab nationalism also and Iraqi nationalism opposed the Assyrian identity and Assyrianism by claiming it for itself. So whoever was going to, you see this image here of Saddam and an Assyrian type of relief. Saddam associated himself with the Ashuriyin in the ancient past. Modern Assyrians were referred to as Athuriyin, so a different pronunciation. The word is really the same, Aturaya, Ashuraya, but according to Iraqi understanding, Ashuriyin represented ancient Assyrians who were the ancestors of modern Iraqis, whereas the Athuriyin or Athuraya represented people who came from outside of Iraq, okay, people from Hakkari. Now, interestingly, in Syria, it's completely the opposite. So Athuri stands for the ancient Assyrians and Ashuri stands for modern Assyrians. Anyway, not that important, just to say there was opposition. And this also, of course, triggered much fear in Iraq from others associating with the Athurai or laying claim to the ancient Assyrian identity. And of course, I've quoted this before in the class, even the hostility that took place before the Simele massacre caused people within the Iraqi parliament to rise against the Assyrians and challenge their assertion that they are in fact Assyrians, and calling the Assyrians, of course, by other terms such as Diaris and others. And so this is one in particular, Sayyid Chalabi Haji Thabit, in the Iraqi parliament in June of 1933, just a couple of months before the Simele massacre. I regret to note that our press still stick to this mysterious name. The group, which calls itself Assyrians, should be named Diaris. They intermingle with the Assyrians and Chaldeans. This is confirmed by their being bilingual. If, for example, there's any of them who can decipher the tablets maintained in our museum, he can make us believe that they are descendants of the great Assyria. Now, interestingly, many of the people who were challenging, and they even have many Assyrians won over with this idea that the Assyrians came from outside of Iraq. Even the borders of Iraq were drawn, late 1920s. A lot of these points were being made by people who were Ottoman subjects, who were, for example, originally either Georgian or Albanian or Turkish, or came from outside of Iraq themselves. So this claim of that the Assyrians are not really Assyrians and they're outsiders was really not based on any historical understanding. If you judge people Assyrian by whether they can read a tablet or not, I think most people in the ancient past weren't able to read tablets anyway. Well, Assyrianism did, in addition to becoming important for the Church of the East and being taken up by the Church of the East, began to be taken up by many within the Assyrian cultural realm, such as singers and poets and writers and novelists and so on and so forth. And we did go over this very carefully in a previous class, just to let you know that the idea was no longer simply among intellectuals. The idea of an Assyria, an association with ancient Assyria, began to be picked up by many in the larger cultural realm. So the impact of Assyrianism on modern music and culture is indeed very powerful and very pronounced these days. And of course, among all of the, we could say, Syriac speaking people, if we want to call them that, we don't want to call everyone Assyrian. This idea became much more of an important and much more of a traditional idea than, for example, other nationalisms, we could say, or other isms within the Assyrian nation. So, what is required? I want to leave you with some questions to kind of ponder on before I go ahead and ask questions of Ms. Gawo and Mr. Younan. How important and relevant is the link between modern Assyrian identity and the ancient Assyrian past? Think about that. What impact does this historical connection have on shaping collective consciousness and belonging today? In other words, as we asked before, I asked Sarah this, if we share a culture, a demography, a language, even looks, I guess one could say DNA or genetic material with each other, how important is that link to the past or understanding of that link to the past? Can one truly be Assyrian without explicitly espousing the name? In other words, is it only about the name? Is Assyrianism only about saying, just like in Christianity, the Lord says, my Lord, not whoever says, my Lord, may enter the kingdom of heaven. Is it the case that only those people who say we are Assyrian? Or is it rooted in something else? Is there shared historical understanding? Is there a shared cultural practice? So all of the people that are espousing these ideas, important to ask them, how much do you really know about the cultural practice? Does one have to call oneself Assyrian to be part of the Assyrian nation? Can individuals or groups who identify as Chaldean or otherwise be still genuine advocates of Assyrianism? In other words, rising above the denominationalism that we talked about and so on, is that not Assyrianism? Is that not the Assyrianism that was espoused by Fredun, Suraya, Naum Fayet, and Benjamin Arsanis and others, Ashur Yousif? The idea that Fredun Aturaya wanted to bring Tur Abdin and the Nineveh plain and Urmia and Hakkari together, if he didn't call it Assyria, if he called it something else, is that not part of Assyrianism, the Assyrianism that he espoused, in other words? Is merely declaring oneself Assyrian sufficient to uphold the principles of Assyrianism, or does Assyrianism demand a deeper intellectual, moral, and cultural commitment beyond name and sentiment? So I will stop here and I will ask Sarah and Pierre some questions, and I will encourage you to join in down the road here with us. So Sarah, I'm sure you've been listening intently. What do you think Assyrianism is based on what we said? Is it political? Is it a political or a social movement? Is it about the name? Is it about linking ourselves with an ancient history, or is it something else?
Thank you, Robbie. For me, Assyrianism generally, refers to that modern movement of, Assyrian identity revival. Um, and it's largely a cultural and social movement. It's not a political movement, and it focuses on, ethnic identity, heritage, and unity rather than solely, a political agenda. Um, is Assyrianism about the name and linking to ancient history? Yes, very much so. And I feel like, again, adopting that name Assyrian is kind of central to this ideology, as it kind of explicitly links the people to the ancient Assyrian civilization and its glory. But really, what it does is it emphasizes the continuity of the Assyrian people from antiquity to today, and it pretty much counters those historical narratives that we have studied in previous classes. But I feel like culturally, Assyrianist writers promoted the use of the Assyrian language and pushed for, Assyrian history, um, achievements for the Assyrian community, symbols and traditions. Um, some examples of that is the Assyrian flag, or even the Kidu festivals. All these are cultural efforts to kind of instill pride in Assyrian heritage. Um, but yeah, importantly, Assyrianism as a more so of a social and cultural movement. And I think it should not necessarily be confused with nationalism and political agendas. I think we're going to get into this a bit later, but it kind of just essentially emphasizes that shared identity among Assyrian descendants scattered around the world, and instills things like, cultural consciousness and, pride for survival.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Much wisdom coming our way from Sarah from the Ashurbanipal Library. A lot of wisdom generated there. Khayat. Um, Pierre from Truma, from the rugged mountains of Truma. Some within our community have said that the rise of Assyrianism has brought more division by having one denomination adopt it and others not so much. Do you think it's correct to say this? Do you think that's the right assessment or not? And why?
I think this is difficult to say. The answer I want to give is what people might not like to hear, in the sense that yes, it has caused the Assyrian identity to be associated as merely a taifa, a sect, and our seems like many of our church leaders are content with that distinction. So while I am happy that Assyrianism survived the First World War and the crimes of Simele, in one sense, survived it, in the Church of the East, in the Nestorian faction of the Church of the East, Nestorian faction of the Church of the East, rather than, gone extinct. I do think that it comes with its drawbacks in the sense that, again, it seems that it's almost entirely associated with the Church of the East rather than being associated with the other necessary components of it. I brought this up in the short reel that we did for Assyrian Cultural Foundation, that the original intellectual progenitors of Assyrianism as a movement were, from our Western Assyrian community, from the Syriac Orthodox faction, even many of those being Protestant as well, people. So it's a shame that there's this sort of mentality that to be a real Assyrian, you must be a part of the quote unquote Assyrian Church of the East, that is the true Assyrian church, that there is no other Assyrian church. Assyrian is an ethnic identity. It goes beyond my religion. My religion is important in another sense. I might say it is important for me first to be a Christian. That is, how I will get to heaven, how I will, have eternal life. There is no eternal life outside of Jesus Christ, in my opinion. Again, just my opinion. But my identity is separate from that. My ethnic identity is separate from that. It's not determinative of what I believe about Nestorius, and whether or not he's a heretic, or whether I believe papal supremacy is applicable. That's an entirely separate thing. That's based on my genetics, my history, my language. And I think it's a big shame that there's sort of this conflation of ideas that the Assyrian Church of the East, that is purely those who are Assyrian, and those who are in other churches are different identities. And, it's sort of coalesced around these ideas. I brought this up last class when there were a group of Arabs who wrote to, or not Arabs, Iraqi Syriac Orthodox that wrote to Farid Nazha and told him, stop using this name in Spanish. Ashuri is for the people who are the Nestorian. And Farid Nazha responds very brilliantly by saying, this name Syriani, Ashuri come from the same root, that is of the Syriac Assyrian people, who are the descendants of the Babylonians and the Chaldeans and the Assyrians. And he said, if the people who are Ashuri are carrying on this name, I should be proud to be called with them, whether or not I am a Nestorian. So I think this is important. I think it's very interesting to note, like even in my family, for example, my family is from the Khabar River Valley. They make distinction between they themselves as Assyrians and then Syriani, who they say, no, they're the same as us, but they're Syriani. It's like that, why are we making a distinction? Like, are they not the same as us? And it's sort of with how they consider themselves in that region, unfortunately. There was a lot of some Syriac Orthodox viewed the Assyrians in the region, the Church of the East Assyrians, as backwards farmers, and they were more educated because they lived in the cities as Syriac Orthodox, and obviously that's very silly to even consider. I almost think of it as in Iraq, this sort of distinction existed as well, but obviously between Chaldean Catholics and Church of the East adherents, you and I were just talking about Patriarch Emmanuel Thomas's comments that he made in 1906 to the Ottoman Sultan. So I think it's important that we move beyond these things, that we move beyond religious sectarian differences. And unfortunately, Assyrianism being embraced by one of these religious sects has really, rather than, made Assyrianism more prominent, in fact, it's really just shrunk it and made it only applicable to a certain part of our nation.
And that, Pierre, excellent observation. And I don't think we should be concerned whether people agree or not. That's your assessment. And so you would say that that's a misunderstanding, not an understanding of what Assyrianism was.
Yeah, 100%. What Assyrianism, the dominant strain of Assyrianism today, unfortunately, what it has become is not what Assyrianism originally was. It's not how the forefathers of Assyrianism envisioned it as. I often think if Naum Fayek saw the state of Assyrianism today and what Assyrianism has become, he would be disgusted. Personally, this is, it's frankly a misappropriation of the term when it's used. I think there's a lot of popular figures, even if they're not religious figures, that also fall into this. I won't name any names. Obviously, I don't want to sit and be critical of specific people here, but they will also say, okay, we're Assyrian. Chaldeans are Assyrian, but they're not real Assyrians. Is almost how they make the distinction.
Yeah.
Our forefathers would have never made such a distinction. I think it's laughable. I think it's I think it's hilarious. I think those same people will also go and look and say, look at our great teacher Martoma Audo, when he was a native of Al-Qush and he was a Chaldean Catholic. But then when they see someone from Al-Qush who's Chaldean today, who might claim Assyrian identity, they will say to them, well, yeah, you're Assyrian, but you're Chaldean, Athen Kildanayu it. It's very silly. I think it exists prominently even in my own family. It's something that I really try to discuss with them and be like, okay, we can't really think about it as this. If you're going to say a Chaldean is an Assyrian, then you need to functionally treat them as an Assyrian, not as a separate entity. And that's really something that's quite prominent. I think even on the other side with Syriac Orthodox adherents, those who are Assyrianists will also at times view Church of the East adherents as, a little different, or, they're more peasant-like just because of what societal differences existed in Arab countries such as Syria and Iraq. And it's very unfortunate. It's very, very, very unfortunate.
Yeah, and I concur with you. I think it is a misunderstanding. I recall I was at a Syriac Orthodox convention one time where we were welcomed among our brothers and sisters, members of the church, and so on. And I remember one person telling me, why I'm not Assyrian, I don't call myself Assyrian, is because Assyrians don't believe Jesus is God. And I thought, okay, you mean Church of the East? He said, well, same thing. So So along those lines, let me ask you this question. What if the movement began among all of the denominations? If that was possible, would that have been much better?
Uh, I think it did. I think the movement did begin among all our denominations. I think that's historically clear. I think we can look and point at each denomination and really.
You named Martuma Odu.
I named Martoma Odu. I think Mar Ogun Mana was also someone who was friendly to the idea of Assyrianism.
Deshir.
I Daisher. I even think Mar Amanul Thomas, say what you will about his comments that he made when he was approached by the King Crane Commission in 1919. He
Yes.
made the statement that he would believe that the Assyro-Chaldean people should receive an independent state. So he was obviously someone that at least adhered to Assyrianism at one point. The first use of the term Assyro-Chaldean in written form was used by the Chaldean Patriarch in 1870 when he was a bishop of Amedia. I believe his name was Yousif Khayath.
Mhm.
He used the term Assyro-Chaldean in a letter to Rome. Again, unprompted and the first use of the term. So that's obviously someone who believes in the oneness and the larger identity of the people. If anything, you could actually really say that the Church of the East sort of lacked the intellectual push in terms of expanding on ideas early on, in my opinion. And I'm saying this as someone who is a Church of the East adherent.
You don't need
So
to
it's kind of
apologize.
no,
Say it
no,
like
it's
it
kind of
is.
it's kind of interesting to sort of note the dichotomy that comes. Even to make another comment, I think even among Syriac Orthodox who might even be friendly to the idea of Assyrianism, what it has come to represent and how the sectarian differences have come to coalesce. You might see Syriac Orthodox people say, of course we are the descendants of the ancient Athuri. Of course they are part of our descendants, but we are not the same as Ashuri. This is a political movement that we do not agree with. This is a common thing I've seen among Syriac Orthodox prelates when having discussions with them about this. Again, not going to name names, but it is something that's very, very interesting to note how they separate the two concepts. The ancient Athuri and then the modern Ashuri are not really connected. Um, and I think part of what we can say, would it have not, you asked the last part of your question is, would
Yeah.
it have been better? I mean, that is what happened. I think the bigger point of contention or point of divergence is really to say, would it have better if there was a state or if there was some sort of autonomous region that was created in the aftermath of the First World War, in which the identity could have coalesced among multiple sects at that point. Um, or would it have been better if there wasn't violence, if the state didn't suppress Assyrianism in the same way that it did in the aftermath of the First World War? So I really think I really think that's an interesting question. I personally, I disagree with the phrasing of it because again, it did start with all the sects. It was embraced by all the sects. I mean, that's what the push was. If anything, like I said, the Church of the East was not in as collaborative uh, with its neighbors as it maybe could have been. I think there was fear of Catholicism that certainly drove the patriarch. I think there was British policy that certainly drove the patriarch in certain directions. And I think politics played a role in all three of the main churches making their political decisions that they made in the aftermath.
But also, I mean, we need to concede that a big part of the effort came from the intellectuals of Urmia. And maybe that led to, the perception, again, the misunderstanding of this movement being peculiar to, or in particular to, a certain area, a certain class of people, a certain group of people. What about, let me ask you, Sarah and Pierre, if you could opine on this as well. What about the naming of the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church of the East in 1976? How does that strike you, Sarah and Pierre?
Um, obviously, like it definitely boosted ethnic pride and, cultural projects. I mean, and I feel like you can really parallel that with other like ethnic national name churches. But to be honest, like again, like I can see how it hardened like identity lines with other churches and denominations and communities. So I can see how the term can feel exclusionary. And with that, it comes big counter movements. I mean, what can we do?
Pierre, what do you think?
I think it was arguably one of the worst decisions ever made
Oh,
in terms of church leadership. I'm not going to hold back on that one. I've been very vocal in my opposition of that. That first off, the church is a faith. It holds to a certain Christological beliefs and certain beliefs about the sacraments and whatnot. That is what the church represents. The church is not an ethnic church. We have Indians in the church, and Indians have long been a part of the history of the church. If we're going to claim to be the true mantle of the Church of the East, so if that's the case, the church was multi-ethnic. That's absolutely the case. Whether or not it originated in the region of Assyria and Athor, that's not up for contention. But again, it is not a mono-ethnic church. I think it causes people who might be interested in looking at the faith of the Church of the East to then say, no, this is a mono-ethnic church. This is really only for one ethnicity. I can't join the church as someone who wants to convert into it. That's actually really not how the church should function. The church is something that's for everyone. That's very clear in biblical teaching. So that first off goes against biblical teaching to try to sort of limit yourself to a certain ethnicity, which is what the implication of that is. Second off, I think it just reinforces what I brought up about the Church of the East and Assyrianism being merely a taifa. I think it actually, there's this whole idea among those who are proponents of Chaldean identity that Marisha Shimun was somehow opposed to the Assyrian name, and that 1976, when Mardincha was consecrated as patriarch and they added the title Assyrian, that this was all part of some grand conspiracy. Marisha Shimun is the one who first, when he met with the Iraqis in 1972, I believe, was the year, who sort of assessed, who went and agreed with this idea that, okay, well, I can't really lead a united Assyrian movement anymore. The Church of the East should merely just be a taifa, and I'm the leader of that taifa, and we can work from there. He was the first one who really put forth that sort of thinking within the church. And I think you can see it even earlier in the patriarchal family, when they, in their treatment of Yousif Malik, who was a Chaldean Catholic adherent and someone who worked fervently for the Assyrian nation. Yousif Malik was mislabeled by Lady Surma as just a Kildinaya. He's not really an Assyrian because he's not part of our church. And that sort of plays into the rivalry that happened between the figures. So I think it was merely a horrible decision. I think that there's kids who grow up Chaldean Catholic these days who can say, no, I'm Chaldean. Look, my church is Chaldean. And, you guys are Assyrian because, look, you have your Assyrian church. And that plays into the sectarian thinking. And it's really hard to then it's not that hard, but I'm saying, like, in their minds, it might be a little bit more difficult to say, no, this title Assyrian is actually something for all of us, regardless if you're in my church or not.
So then,
yeah.
Let me ask you this. So is it fair then to, the church in India is called the Chaldean church, or sometimes the Syrian
Chaldean
church.
Syrian. Chaldean
Yeah.
Syrian.
And the Roman Catholic Church is the Roman Catholic Church. You could say that that's almost the ethnicity. There's a church called the Armenian Church. There's a church called the Bulgarian Church, a Greek Orthodox Church. Now, what could be a member of the Greek Orthodox Church and not be Greek? And what could be a member of the Armenian Catholic or Armenian Orthodox Church and not be an Armenian? Why is that so hard? And I don't want you to answer. I got your point. But why is that so hard? And I don't have the answer. To think that the term could be used, for example, one term could be used Chaldean, one term could be used Syriac, and the word Assyrian should not be used. Perhaps your point is, Pierre, that the Assyrian is kind of an umbrella term for all of these expressions, but to pin it to one church takes away from its kind of umbrella structure, as it were, the foundational structure for all the churches. All right. Bishop Sarhad Jammu. Everybody knows the late Bishop Sarhad Jammu. He defended his position by advocating a Chaldeanism. I don't want to say Chaldean nationalism. He wasn't looking for a state, but he certainly advocated people away from Arabism and towards understanding their language and their culture and their history. What do you say, about his position. Sarah, let me get something from you and then from Pierre. What do you say about Serhad's position? Do you think it was good or bad? He's teaching people his language, his culture, and so on and so forth, particularly at a time, by the way, long time ago, I mean, in the 70s, when people were used to just saying, okay, that's fine, we're Arabs or we're just Iraqis in Michigan.
Yeah, I think in a way it was good to secure like that formal representation and visibility, but I just think it is complicated. I mean, it already kind of fragmented an already small people into like smaller political and cultural blocks, and it kind of really it lessened like a collective leverage. So I see how his position yielded cultural gains, but I mean, I don't know at what cost? A bigger rift? I don't know.
Pierre, what do you think?
I'm gonna try to keep my answer shorter than the other ones, but I actually will disagree. I am, believe it or not, I will take this to be a positive thing. I think we were at a tipping point at that point with how Baathism was being applied to our people, Arab nationalism was being applied to our people, and I think there was a sort of line where it's like, okay, you either embrace the Arab Christian identity or you embrace a separate identity. And at the time, obviously, there was tensions between Iraq and the United States, and there was this whole idea that perhaps there needed to be something separating Chaldeans from Iraq due to those bad associations with Iraq here in America, where Sarhad Jammu lived most of his life here in America. I think it's really was just pushing something that kind of already existed in Iraq. When I was mentioning this to you, there was sort of a societal distinction or a social cleavage that existed in Iraq, in my opinion, where you might say that Chaldean Catholics were considered loyal citizens of Iraq. I think being Chaldean as an identity was very closely tied to the state of Iraq and being Iraqi. And I think that on the other end, promoting something like Chaldeanism really kind of hopes to separate the identity from Iraq, which does, in a sense, bring it closer to Assyrianism and yields some amount of cultural gain, as Sarah conceded, whether it be preservation of the language and the identity. In any sense, I'm in favor of that. If you wanted to call the language, I don't know, if you wanted to say that this language is the language of the trees, but it's really Sudeth and you're preserving Sudeth, that's ultimately positive, whether or not you're calling it Assyrian.
All right, so could he have said, would this be better had he said, we're all Chaldean? I am referring to my understanding of Chaldean as an ancient term, the last phase of Mesopotamian culture, a term that has been used for hundreds of years. We are all, after all, Chaldean. Some of us call ourselves Assyrian, some of us call ourselves Aramean, Syriac, but really we are all Chaldean. And by the way, the same for the other terms. I want to throw these at you: Syriac or Aramean. Could the word Assyrian be replaced by Chaldean or Syriac or Aramean?
Yes and no. I think those
what
words
will be, okay, let me ask it this way. What will be missed if those terms are used instead of Assyrian?
So let's just take Sarhad Jammu's position, which I would say is probably the most intellectually consistent Chaldean position. His position is that those that we might call the East Syriac, so that we are Chaldeans, all of us, even us in the Church of the East would be Chaldeans. That was his intellectual position. But the problem is it leaves out our Western brothers. Sarhad Jammu didn't really tackle that sort of identity debate with them. He mostly focused on the Madanthaya.
He did not include it. He didn't want it.
Yeah, he did. Okay, yeah, so he didn't include it. So at that point, it leaves out a whole portion of Mesopotamian civilization and a whole part of the church, the Syriac churches. I think Arameanism does a little bit too much of over inclusivity in their identity if you're following an intellectually consistent position of Arameanism. So in that position, people who are Maronite, people who are Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholic in the Middle East, and I don't know if I'm missing another one, but and then those churches that are from Mesopotamia, Syriac Catholic, Syrian Church of the East, Chaldean Catholic, Syriac Orthodox, they're all part of the Aramean identity. At that point, while it may seem like a stronger position, you are including people, you're actually watering down what the identity means. People like Rum Orthodox or Greek Catholics have very little connection to the Aramaic language. In fact, their claim is really almost entirely based that Syriac was used in their liturgy at one point over 1,000 years ago. For Maronites, obviously, it's still used today. So you actually really watered down the Assyrian identity or the Aramean identity by saying, okay, it's this whole thing. If you're going to include those Christians, why aren't you including Muslims that might be genetically similar to them at that point? That's the argument I would make. Especially, you can see that in genetics of certain people in the Middle East. If you talk about Assyrianism, I think Assyrianism is the happy medium in the sense that, our identity is entirely based on the native people of Mesopotamia, of North Mesopotamia, which having continuously inhabited this area for thousands of years. Whether or not of our denominations is irrelevant. Speaking the language is important. If the language was lost recently, we sort of make exception for that. Example being like Maslawi people, people from Mosul who obviously used to speak the language in the 1700s, but ceased to speak it after that. So we sort of have an inclusive identity within the borders of Mesopotamia. We use geography here, not just a sort of, winner take all of religion like Arameanism, and not super inclusive position.
All right. So the short of it, Pierre, is you're saying it must include historical truth.
Absolutely.
All right. So and Arameanism and Chaldeanism does not, is what you're saying.
I think they reflect parts of historical truth in the sense that we can say Arameanism, like we obviously have a very close relationship historically with the Maronite community. We might even say that some of the Maronite forefathers themselves were of the Mesopotamian stock. But they're obviously, there's a historical truth that is not the same people as us, that is not the same region as us. They are far past the river Euphrates. And Chaldeanism doesn't reflect the historical truth that, there's this very close interconnected relationship between Syriac Orthodox and Syriac Catholic. I think when you do something like when you adhere to a position of Chaldeanism, you come to a very, very, very big problem in two senses. When you say, okay, what about the Chaldeans of Mardin and Diyarbakir? Are they Chaldean? And if you say yes, okay, then so must their neighbors be. And if you go on the other side and you say, okay, Baghdada, Bartalla, Bashika, Bazani, these villages in the Nineveh Plains are all Syriac Orthodox / Catholic. They're very similar to their Chaldean Catholic neighbors. Are they not the same people as you? I think this brings up a very, very big problem.
Yeah. So I mean, let me kind of sum it up. So I think that what we're saying is there needs to be some historical truth here, so that something is just not just made up, completely from the imagination. There needs to be some geographic, some demographic basis. There needs to be some social benefit. We distinguish Assyrianism from, say, Assyrian nationalism, the striving to create a state. So Assyrianism is more of a social, as Sarah pointed out, a cultural movement. So Assyrianism links back to the past, and that past is, as we've shown, historically truthful. It's not completely concocted or made up or twisted or tweaked in a certain way. And I do see, Pierre, with the increase of communication, and Sarah, that Assyrians are talking to each other more. Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, whatever names that are used. And I see also that the greater the interaction among our people, the greater the understanding of the oneness of our people, and the greater also the understanding of the necessity of coming together and finding common cause and seeing the oneness of our destiny. I think that's really very important. And I see that in what you're saying, Pierre, and what you're saying, Sarah, and what everybody has been saying.